In 1992, workers digging beneath a palace in Addis Ababa made a discovery that stopped them cold. Human remains, buried in secret, hidden beneath a concrete floor, directly under the office of the dictator who had ruled Ethiopia for 17 years. They belonged to a man that millions of people across Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond had worshipped as the living God, a man whose face appeared on flags, whose name was sung by Bob Marley, whose coronation drew royalty from around the world. He was an emperor, a prophet to some, a tyrant to others. So how did the King of Kings end up buried beneath the floor like a secret? This is the story of Haile Selassie. Long before the crown, before millions worshipped his name, before the world knew him as emperor, he was simply a boy named Tafari Makonnen. He was born on July 23, 1892, in the highlands of Harar, into one of the most remarkable royal lines on earth, because Ethiopia's emperors claimed something no other dynasty dared to claim: descent from King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba herself. A bloodline, they said, stretching back 3,000 years. Whether legend or history, and scholars still debate it, this belief made Ethiopia's throne sacred, and it would one day convince millions that the man who sat upon it was divine. When Tafari was just 3 years old, his nation did the unthinkable. At the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Ethiopian forces defeated an invading Italian army. It was one of the only times in history that an African nation defeated a European power in a major battle and kept its independence. By 1900, almost the entire continent had been claimed by European empires. Ethiopia stood alone, free. But Italy never forgot Adwa, and that humiliation would return with terrible consequences. Inside the imperial court, young Tafari was quietly becoming impossible to ignore. He was small in stature, soft-spoken, but behind those calm eyes was one of the sharpest political minds Africa has ever produced. He outmaneuvered rivals decades older than himself, and by 1916, at just 24 years old, he had become regent, the true power behind the Ethiopian throne. Then he did something Ethiopian rulers had never done. He looked outward. He toured Europe. He brought Ethiopia into the League of Nations. He built schools, a modern army, printing presses, and hospitals. He was pulling an ancient empire into the 20th century, one reform at a time. And in November 1930, in a ceremony watched by the world, Tafari Makonnen was crowned emperor. He took a new name, Haile Selassie, power of the Trinity, and with it, titles that echoed like scripture: King of Kings, Elect of God, Conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. 4,000 miles away in Jamaica, those words landed like a thunderbolt. Years earlier, the Jamaican activist Marcus Garvey had reportedly told his followers to look to Africa, where a black king would be crowned as a sign of deliverance. Now here was that king, crowned in glory, claiming descent from Solomon, bearing the very titles written in the Book of Revelation. For thousands of Jamaicans, descendants of enslaved Africans, this was not a coincidence. This was prophecy. They took his birth name, Rastafari, and made it their own. The Rastafari movement was born. And to its followers, Haile Selassie was not merely an emperor. He was divine. But here is the twist almost no one expects. Haile Selassie never claimed to be God. He was a devout Ethiopian Orthodox Christian his entire life, and he reportedly told followers he was simply a man. But faith is a powerful thing. His humility only deepened their devotion. After all, they reasoned, wouldn't true divinity be humble? Meanwhile, in Italy, a dictator was promising his people a new Roman Empire, and Benito Mussolini wanted revenge for Adwa. In October 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia with tanks, aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of troops against a nation defending itself, in places with rifles from the previous century. And then Mussolini's forces crossed a line that shocked the world. They used banned chemical weapons against soldiers and civilians alike in violation of international law. Ethiopian fighters resisted with astonishing courage, but by May 1936, the capital had fallen, and the emperor made an agonizing choice, one still debated to this day. He left into exile. Some called it wisdom, others called it abandonment. He would settle, of all places, in Bath, England, and then came the moment that made him immortal. June 30th, 1936, the League of Nations in Geneva. The exiled Emperor of Ethiopia rose to address the world. Calmly, in his own language, he described the suffering of his people and the betrayal of a small nation that had trusted in collective security. And he left the world with a warning history would never forget. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. The assembly did almost nothing. The great powers looked away. 3 years later, Hitler invaded Poland. World War II had begun. The emperor's prophecy had come true. But history was not finished with Haile Selassie. In 1941, backed by British forces and Ethiopia's own resistance fighters, he returned. 5 years to the day after the Italians seized his capital, he marched back into Addis Ababa. The lion had come home. And now he was no longer just Ethiopia's emperor. He was a symbol for every colonized nation on earth. As Africa's colonies won their freedom in the 1950s and 60s, their leaders looked to the one nation that had never been fully conquered. And in May 1963, Haile Selassie gathered the leaders of 32 newly independent nations in Addis Ababa to found the Organization of African Unity, the ancestor of today's African Union. Its headquarters remain in Ethiopia to this day. Abroad, he was celebrated, honored in Washington, London, and Moscow, named Time magazine's Man of the Year. But at home, a very different story was unfolding. Behind the medals and the motorcades, Ethiopia remained one of the poorest nations on earth. Most of its people were farmers, bound to land they did not own, paying heavy tributes to noble landlords under a feudal system centuries out of date. The emperor, who had modernized Ethiopia's image, had left its foundations untouched. A new generation, educated in the very schools he had built, began asking dangerous questions. Why does one man hold absolute power? Why do landlords own the harvest? Why is there no real voice for the people? The answer came in arrests, censorship, and prisons. The emperor's Ethiopia had no room for dissent. And then came the catastrophe that broke the empire. In the early 1970s, drought struck the northern province of Wollo. The harvests failed. A devastating famine swept the region, and tens of thousands of people lost their lives. At first, the government's response was silence. Officials downplayed the crisis, seemingly more concerned with the empire's image than its people. Then, in 1973, a British documentary showed the suffering in Wollo, side by side, with scenes of imperial luxury. For millions of Ethiopians, something snapped. In 1974, it all came apart. Rising fuel prices, strikes, protests in the streets, and from within the military, a shadowy committee of junior officers began to move. They called themselves the Derg. Month by month, the Derg arrested the emperor's ministers and stripped away his powers. A slow-motion coup the old lion seemed powerless to stop. And on September 12, 1974, soldiers came for the King of Kings himself. The man who had ruled for nearly 6 decades was driven away from his palace in the back seat of a small blue Volkswagen. 3,000 years of claimed Solomonic rule ended in a hatchback. He spent his final months a prisoner in his own palace grounds. And on August 27, 1975, state media announced that the former emperor was dead. The official explanation was natural causes, following a medical procedure. Almost no one believed it. Many historians, and later an Ethiopian court, concluded that he was killed on the orders of the new regime. The exact circumstances remain disputed to this day. What we do know is this. In 1992, after the Derg's dictator fell from power, the emperor's remains were found buried beneath the palace. Some accounts claim they lay beneath the very office where the dictator worked. The message of such a burial, if true, is chilling. The new ruler of Ethiopia, sitting each day above the resting place of the old. In the year 2000, a quarter century after his death, Haile Selassie was finally given a proper burial at Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa. Among the mourners stood Rastafari believers who had traveled across oceans, many of whom insist to this day that Jah cannot die, because by then his name had conquered the world in a way no army ever could. Bob Marley, the most famous Rastafari of all, carried the emperor's words into global anthems. Marley's song War is, almost word for word, a speech Haile Selassie delivered to the United Nations in 1963, a call for a world where the color of a man's skin means no more than the color of his eyes. So who was he really? To some, he was a visionary, the father of African unity, the man who stood alone before the world and warned of the darkness to come, and was proven right. To others, he was an autocrat, a feudal monarch who lived in palaces while his people went hungry and answered their cries with prison cells. Perhaps the uncomfortable truth is that he was both. Millions called him God. History remembers him as a man who inspired hope, changed a continent, and left behind one of the most extraordinary legacies in African history. This is the African Chronicle, where the stories they didn't teach you finally get told. Subscribe and stay with us. There are 1,000 more stories where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.